Hi, everyone. Good evening. My name is Edwin Kelley. I'm an instructor with the Tergar meditation community. And this evening, I'm here in Minneapolis, suburban Minneapolis in Minnesota, in the upper Midwest of the US. So, welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm just looking at some of the comments in the chat room. We've got people from Argentina and Japan and Brazil, New Orleans, Wisconsin, California, Washington State, people from all over the place. So thank you all so much for tuning in. So tonight's talk is called Let Depression Wake You Up. And I think, first of all, I should just state, to be very clear, to be honest, I am not a psychologist. I am not a therapist. I've not trained, I don't have any classical psychological training. And so I will not be talking about depression from a clinical psychological perspective. I am a meditator. I have been meditating for 45 years or more and have done some significant intensive retreat, which basically means I have invested considerable time looking at my own mind and exploring and examining what goes on in my own heart and mind from a meditator's perspective. And so it's the understanding and wisdom that comes from those practices that I would really like to share with you tonight. So first of all, I just want to acknowledge that in the last couple of weeks, Miyoshi Kelley and Mingo Rinpoche have both talked fairly extensively about difficult and afflictive emotions, challenging emotions, how they manifest in our heart and minds, and how we can work with them from this tradition, meditative tradition. And there are a lot of very skillful ways that we can utilize from this tradition. And so I will kind of summarize a little bit of what they said, or be touching on some of what they said, but I'll also be addressing these challenging and difficult emotions from yet another perspective, and primarily from the perspective of how we create this solid, separate sense of self and identify and appropriate our experiences, and in doing so, concretize or make real or reify our experience and cling to it in a way that contributes to our suffering. And we'll do a little meditation and explore ways that we can examine this sense of self and help to, along with the other practices we've done, to help explore and loosen up and let go a little of this way in which we cling to our identity and these strong experiences that we have, and particularly exploring it from the aspect of the stories we tell ourselves. First of all, I think it's worth just reflecting back that all of our strong emotional experiences, and that includes depression, is really a constellation of experience. There's not one thing that contributes to it. Even in the experience of the emotion, there's not one thing that's happening. It can have elements that are physical, our body. It can have elements that are psychological. It can have elements that are emotional, a lot of which comes from our conditioning. It could be a family setting or a social setting or a professional work environment. There's just so many aspects that contribute to our deep and troubling emotional experiences. But in all of them, or in most cases, we tend to think that these things are solid, that this is the way it is, that they are permanent, that they cannot change. I will be this way forever. This is who I truly am. And that can lead to a lot of despair and difficulty, challenges in an effort to work with these, to transform these experiences. But because they are composite, a constellation made up of a myriad of pieces that also means that we can examine and work with any particular element that makes up these experiences and affect or relate to those experiences in a different way that ultimately enables them to change. And so that just means that, notwithstanding the fact that we may be afflicted by some very, very challenging, difficult emotional experiences, just the fact that they're so composite and so conditioned means that it's possible for us to chip away at elements of that, and that can maybe slowly but ultimately lead to and result in some transformation of our experience. So, having said that, I think I'll move on to just summarize a little bit of what Rinpoche and Myoshin and even these series of talks by Rinpoche and the instructors have touched on over recent weeks, is the three main areas of practice that come to us from the Buddhist tradition. And those three primary practices are initially awareness. Mingyur Rinpoche's talked a lot about awareness. The practices of loving kindness and compassion, and we've also talked quite a bit about them. And then also the practice of wisdom. And I'll just speak to all three of them a little bit, but most of what I want to speak to later in the talk is a little bit more about the wisdom practices, particularly how we can examine the way we create this solid sense of self, and how it's built on a lot of misperception or erroneous perception of how things are. And if we can realign our understanding and see more clearly how things truly are and adjust our view of the world to align with how things truly are, then our suffering is mitigated. Our suffering begins to diminish, even though suffering is inherent in conditioned reality. At least if our way of seeing things aligns more clearly or accurately with how things are, then we will be creating less difficulty. There will be less self-made suffering involved in our experience. So the awareness aspect of our practice, how many times have we heard Mingyur Rinpoche say awareness is the essence of meditation? This inherent capacity to know, this cognizant, radiant, clear nature of the mind that at any time is capable of connecting to present moment experience and knowing what is happening. And all the practices that we do to use awareness as support for our meditation and our experience as support for recognition of awareness, all of those practices are in that realm of awareness. And what that practice is about is continually shining the light of the knowing quality of our mind onto our experience. It's like turning the lights on in our experience so that we can see what is happening. And rather than being distracted or carried away by experience or beguiled by our experience, rather than getting lost in our experience, we are just learning how to show up, connect to present moment experience, and observe, inquire, examine what is happening so that we get familiar with what's going on in our heart and mind. And this familiarity creates more sense of presence and connection to our experience. And that in and of itself can be extremely transformative because we begin to see things we had not noticed before. And once we notice things and understand things through the practice of awareness, then we're armed with choices about how we can change the way we relate to our experience. So that's the awareness aspect of these teachings. The second body of teachings that I spoke about is the loving kindness, compassion, or in this tradition, what we call the four immeasurables, which are accompanied also with joy, appreciation, or appreciative joy, and equanimity, this calm and balanced mind. And these practices are really designed to qualitatively change the way we're relating to our experience, rather than be in this adversarial relationship, this tug of war with our experience. And Minga Rinpoche spoke to this last weekend very, very skillfully. This whole idea of aversion and grasping or desire, we invariably are in one of three relationships to our experience. We're either clinging or leaning into it, wanting, grasping, craving, wanting things to be a certain way or hold on to the way they are because we like it, or we're in the opposite of that, which is this aversive, adversarial, I don't want, push away, get out of my sight kind of relationship to the things that are unpleasant, the things that we don't want. And while ever we're in either one of these relationships, then we are no longer free, or we are not free from the circumstances that surround us, because so much of our life we are unable to control. The third aspect he talked to was confusion or ignorance, a delusion, which is kind of fundamental or underpins this relationship, this adversarial relationship we have to our practices, to our experiences, sorry. So this whole notion of loving kindness and compassion can soften our heart, expand our heart and mind, make things more spacious, give us the capacity to welcome all of our experience, whether we like it or we don't like it, to give us a little space and let go of the craving for what we like and the aversion for what we don't like. It puts us on a friendly footing with our experience, which is equally as important as being able to observe our experience. Because while ever we're not on a friendly footing with our experience, we are suffering. We are wanting it to be otherwise, and that's not a strategy for peace of mind. So the first one, awareness, the second one, loving kindness, we've talked quite a lot about, and we have experienced a lot of the practices associated with those two modes of practice, and we've learned a lot about how valuable they are. So this third aspect that I want to talk about is the wisdom aspect, or how we create this sense of solidity and reify things. But before I step into that a little bit more, I also want to say, particularly with regards to very deep, afflictive, chronic, long-term emotional challenges, particularly like depression, that I want to be clear that I don't want to give the false expectation, and I want to be clear that meditation is not a panacea. It's not. Some people, or many people who have suffered for a long time, may come to meditation with an expectation that they will be fixed very quickly. You know, they've tried therapy, they've tried pharmaceuticals, either pharmaceutical drugs or recreational drugs, or a whole host of various kinds of ways, therapy, etc. They've worked in very deep ways with your struggles, with your difficulties, and have found it continually challenging. And when they hear about meditation, might immediately think, "Oh, this will fix it." And it's true. With time, meditation practice can really, as I said, transform our relationship to our experience. But I want to be very clear: it takes time, and primarily because, as we'll talk a little bit about it shortly, how deeply entrenched our habits are for clinging to to our reality, to our perception of how things are. So, having said that, I want to now just go back and touch on something that Minga Rinpoche talked about last week. He, in his depiction of our deep emotional experiences, he refers to four elements. Most or all of our afflictive emotional experiences contain one or more or all of the following. There's the story, the audio. There's an audio line. There's either somebody else's voice or your voice that's telling you what happened and what it is and why it is, what I call the story. Secondly, there is the video. There are images, and these might be memories of past experiences. They might even be imaginations of future experiences. But there's always some picture associated with the difficult emotion. Thirdly, there's the physical sensations. What's going on in the body? Our heart rate might be increased. Our breath might be shallow. We may have tension somewhere in our body, our stomach, our shoulders. We might be contracted physically. There might be heat. There might be vibrations. There's a whole host of physical sensations that accompany our emotional experience. And then finally, the fourth element that Rinpoche talks about is the emotion itself, or the tone of mind, or the state of mind. Sadness, anxiety, all of these things have a sort of a shading in the mind or a coloration in the mind. Let's get back to what I was going to say, is that any or all of these four elements we can use as support for our awareness and focus in on at any given time, and with loving kindness, with awareness, with inquiry. We can use any one of these four experiences to connect to and understand more deeply our emotional experience. So that's why we have so many different techniques for examining, exploring the emotional terrain of our heart and mind. So as I said, tonight I want to focus a little bit more on the story side of things. But before I do, I want to say, particularly with regards to these four, one of the things that Mingyur Rinpoche often talks about is stepping back. If we're really caught up in our experience, it can become very overwhelming or very debilitating in some way. And quite often there's a need to kind of pan out or step back from our experience and see if we can't find other accompanying things that are going on that maybe fuel or underlie our emotions. The way I like to talk about this is, like we all were familiar with going to live theatre, and any play, any theatre production, invariably, there's the story, there's the plot, there's the characters, the character development. It's set in a particular time. There's so much, and the dialogue, and it becomes very animated and lively in live theatre. But also, and this is true of movies too, there is invariably the lighting and the soundtrack that really set the mood for the story, the play, the drama. Horror movies or suspense movies have this very discordant, music that, or if the dark, seedy lighting can set up a mood and so forth. And so this is the sort of thing that can be going on in our mind when we have some strong emotional experience. There well may be some tone of mind, coloration of mind, like the lighting or the soundtrack, that is informing or fueling what's going on in our heart and mind. And so being able to see these pieces is really important. So having said all of that, set the stage up, where I would like to go is to talk about the story. Well, the way the stories that we create and repeat around our experiences, and particularly the challenging and difficult experiences, lead to the strengthening, what I would say, reifying or concretizing, making real or solidifying the story. or our experience. One of my own experiences in my life that I often think of when I talk about this is when I was 18 years of age in my first year at university in Sydney, in Australia. I had my mid-year break. It was, of course, it's wintertime in Australia in July, and I had 2 weeks off from university, and I took a job down in the country where I grew up, milking cows. And at the end of that 2 weeks, I was riding home I had a friend lent me his motorcycle, and I'm riding home at dusk after 2 weeks of working on this dairy farm. Saturday night, Sunday, the next day, I was flying back to Sydney to go back to university. And the short story is I ran out of road, was thrown through the air head first, and my head hit the embankment. And I got really bad. I was knocked unconscious, got really bad concussion, kind of put my head down. I had a physical therapist many years later tell me I tried to put my head in my chest and was very clear that you can't do that. But I fractured I dislocated my collarbone, tore a bunch of muscles, was really badly concussed, and the pressure down my spine fractured one of my vertebrae. And I spent 3 weeks in hospital. And so it was quite a physically traumatic experience, which then has resulted in a lifetime of, pain, suffering, discomfort, and a need for continued maintenance, whether it's physical therapy or massages or acupuncture or inordinate amount of physical therapies to keep my body flexible and mitigate some of the pain. And I noticed that every time I go to a therapist, or every time I get a new massage therapist, or go and see a doctor, or tell the story, it's like, this is my story. And so much of my identification of my experience, I was just a kid. I had this nasty motorcycle accident. And particularly because now when I practice, or ever since then, every time I meditate and sit, in this posture, it doesn't matter whether I'm sitting in a chair or where it is, I feel this trauma, this pain that's locked in my body. And so I don't know how many times I've told myself this story, or how many times I've repeated this story. And what I began to notice through my meditation was that there was some way in which every time I told the story to myself or to someone else, it just reinforced my identification with and my appropriation. This is my story. I am the story, over and over and over. And I began to realize that this is exactly what we do with traumatic experience, whether it's emotional or physical, that there's some way in which we latch on to our experience and we repeat it over and over, or every time it comes up, we relive it. We can be re-traumatized by it. But there are two primary modes or modalities whereby we strengthen this story or make it more and more real. And those two methods are, one, we appropriate the story or elements of it, like my back. And the amazing thing about appropriation is that we do that all the time. There's, we think about your material possessions, your house, my car, or my bicycle if you don't have a car, or think of your favorite toys, whether it's your music or my music, my iPhone, my clothes if you like to dress up. All our material possessions, we put this preposition of my, it belongs to me. And the notion of my is you grab it and it belongs to you. It's now, I got it. And I call this appropriation. And we not only appropriate our material possessions, we also appropriate living beings, my mother, my father, my daughter, my sister, my cousin, my boss, my There's so many ways in which we actually own living beings. Uh, well, one of the other ways we appropriate, yes, so we appropriate by our possessions and we appropriate by those we love, or those physical living beings we're connected to. And then the third way, or the third level of appropriation, is our thoughts, our feelings. So it gets subtler and subtler, from external objects to people we love to our inner world and the content of our inner world. All of these we develop strategies for appropriating. We own these things. And in doing so, we're kind of creating this way of grasping. So, my emotions, my experience, my thoughts, it gets very, very subtle. And particularly when traumatic and difficult emotional experiences are involved, that appropriation only reaffirms, reinforces the reality of it. And if there's suffering associated with it, it reifies that suffering. So the second method of creating this is the identification. I am. And we do this by our nationality. I am Australian. I'm also now an American. I have 2 passports, so I'm a dual citizen. I have 2 nationalities. Our gender, I'm a man, I'm a woman, and then of course that's why it's so confusing for people about gender fluidity and so forth. But we still identified or identifying with our gender, our race, our profession. I am an accountant. I am a doctor. I am a lawyer. I am a bus driver. And our relationships too. Like I said earlier, we say my father, but I am a son in relationship to my father. My daughter, I am a father in relationship to my daughter. So there's this identification, I am. And both appropriation and identification are ways in which we reify this sense. And so the wisdom practices are really techniques to examine the ways we appropriate and reify and challenge and question, is this really the way it is? And in the teachings that come from this tradition, there are 3 misperceptions that we have. One is this notion of permanence. And so this sense of self, this I, this me, this my, we see as being permanent. It's been with us since we can remember, and this is the way it is. The other way we misunderstand it is that we think there's just me, I'm single. There's just one of me. Whoever Edwin is, there's only one of him, and he is here, and this is who I am. And the third way we misunderstand it is to believe I'm independent. I am separate from you and everything else in my world. I am independent from everything. But when we begin to examine more closely, what we really see is that everything is impermanent, even me. I'm not the same guy that woke up this morning. I'm not the same guy as I was yesterday. I'm certainly not the same guy I was 20 years ago. And as time goes on, I will change. I will age. I will die. Everything is constantly changing. It's easier to see that in the external world, particularly these last couple of weeks here in Minneapolis. We've had a really beautiful spring. It's been cooler, damper. And so all those spring blossoms have sort of come out slowly into full blossom and sort of hung around on the trees for at least a week or 10 days. But the other morning, in front of our apartment here, there's a crabapple tree that this year was just amazing, beautiful pink blooms, and the whole tree was just covered in it. We're on the second floor, so it's like the top of the tree is right level with our eyesight. And the other morning, I was sitting outside on the balcony. It's screened in, or it's a 3-season porch. And so I could sit there and look into this tree, and there was a gentle breeze, and then it was followed by rain. And just to see this amazing, beautiful bloom slowly begin to disintegrate. Every time the breeze got up, more petals fell off. And, here I was just in total, admiration of the beauty of this spring bloom, and then just watching it slowly just disintegrate in front of my eyes And it's continued to do so over the last few days. So we can see impermanence in that way in nature, but we have trouble seeing impermanence in our own heart and mind. Similarly, for the single part, there is one Edwin, and this is me, but I'm made up of many things. There's my emotions, there's my thoughts, there's my past, there's, and I feel like this now and I feel like that later on, and it's constantly different. There's many parts of it constantly changing and so forth. I'm a multiplicity or a multitude of elements and bits and pieces, even physically. There's my my fingers and my arms and my hands and my back and my front, and all of the different parts of me that make up who I am is the way we are. So this notion that we're single and separate is actually a misperception. And then finally, the interdependence rather than independence. Everything comes together, including ourselves, including every breath, dependent upon a myriad, a host of conditions. The oxygen in the air, the life in my body, the expansion and contraction of my lungs, the food I ate that gives me the energy for my lungs. Everything is composite and interdependent. But in actual fact, we cling to this notion that we are a single, solid, separate self. And everything we relate to by appropriating and identifying only serves to reify that, to strengthen that, to make it more and more real. And this is the way in which we perpetuate our suffering. And so, first of all, just aligning with the notion that everything is impermanent, including ourselves. Everything is multiple, including ourselves. Everything is interdependent, including ourselves, shifts our reality in the relative level to understanding more clearly, or our thinking or understanding is more in alignment with how things truly are. And in this understanding, we begin to mitigate our suffering. So, I see somebody wants to know, when are we going to meditate? And I think we've arrived at the point where we're going to meditate. So I want to do a meditation, just guide a short meditation here that that really begins to examine this notion of self and this notion of us being single and separate, and particularly with relationship to our afflictive emotions. So I don't want to dictate what emotion it is. We're all different. We all have different experiences and different paths. We probably all have our pet afflictive emotion, something that's been around for a long time we've been working on. So I'll let you bring to mind whatever the emotion is that you want to examine through the lens of this practice. So let's begin by just finding a posture, our meditation posture, and the two most important elements are that our body, our spine is upright as best as possible, but that we're at ease. There's not a tension. We're not holding tightly. We're not clinging. We're actually sitting here relaxed. So having connected to our physical posture, just feel the body for a moment. However you are, sitting on your cushion or on a chair, feel the sensation of touch where your body touches the chair, the floor, the ground, or your hands rest on your lap, knees, wherever. Awareness of physical posture and sensations, or using our physical experience, physical sensations as support for our awareness. And taking a little time to just check in with our motivation to engage in this practice so that it will be of benefit to ourselves and to others, to all beings. And whatever emotion came to mind when I mentioned it a little earlier, whatever it might be, anxiety, fear, jealousy, hatred, aversion, depression, whatever comes to mind. And as you bring it up, you will notice there's probably a story, there's probably a picture, maybe there's physical sensations. So, whichever of these experiences are most strong, ask yourself, is this my emotion? Am I appropriating this emotion? This is my feeling, this is my emotion, this is my anger, my anxiety. Is there a sense in which you're strongly holding on to this or grasping onto this as my experience? And who is this person that owns this experience? Where are they located? What do they look like? What shape are they? Where do they come from? This person that owns this experience, this self. And another way we can do this is to ask oneself, am I identified with this emotion? Is there a way in which you would say, I am anxious, I am depressed, I am lonely, I am sad, I am happy? Whatever the emotion is there a way in which we identify with this experience? I am. And so then, if we are identified with this experience, just loosely ask yourself, who is this I, this person I call me? What does it look like? Where does it exist? Is it in my heart? Is it in my mind? Is it in my body? Is it in a particular part of my body? Is it in a particular part of my mind? Where does it come from? Does it exist all the time? Does it arise and pass away? Is it changing? Who is this I, this me? Where is it? So we're kind of using this awareness, this knowing quality of the mind, and directing this knowing, looking directly at this sense of me or I or mine, my. And there's a sense of inquiry or examination, questioning. How real is this I, or how solid is this I, this me? Where does it hang out? Where does it reside? Where does it live? And sometimes these questions can be a little perplexing, and they're rhetorical in sense. It's not like as though we do this inquiry with an expectation we will find something. You may even notice that there's nothing to find. And that if you don't find anything, then perhaps that creates a certain space, a certain loose relaxation, letting go of the grasping to the difficult experience. And it creates a more spacious, a less identified, a less tight, less holding. So this experience just is. It's not necessarily mine. It's not necessarily happening to me. It's happening, yes. It's not that it's not real, it's happening. In that sense, it's real. But we don't need to overlay the experience with this strong grasping, appropriation, belonging, or the strong identification sense of me associated with it. So every time some emotion, some something strong comes up in your experience, just ask yourself, is this my experience? Is this happening to me? Is this who I am? This is the nature of the wisdom inquiry, the Vipassana practices from this tradition. We begin by examining our experience, and questioning how we are identifying and appropriating our experience, and how we are relating to it as something that's solid, permanent, single, and separate from everything else. And slowly we can begin to see it's changing, it's impermanent. There's a lot going on here. There's many things, it's multiple, and it's all conditioned. It's all dependent upon a myriad of conditions. Things come together, and I have this experience. Things cease to be together, coming together, and the experience goes away. And our meditation through awareness, opening our heart, and examining in this way can help to show to us how things really are. And as we begin to more deeply understand how things are, our understanding aligns more closely with the true nature of our experience. This is how our meditation works. Okay, so we're 43 past the hour, and I don't know whether there are any questions. If you have any questions you want to ask, please go to the live chat and put in your questions. I know it takes a little while. There's a little time delay between when you write it and I see it. Uh, but if you have anything you particularly want to ask about this practice, we could spend a few minutes. And again, thank you very much for being here in attendance and listening to this. I hope you found it of some benefit. These practices, these wisdom practices, some people find very challenging. Sometimes because when we ask these questions, we look, we don't see anything, and actually what we see is that there's nothing there, or we may have experiences that are in this tradition are kind of identified as a glimpse of emptiness, and that can be really quite unnerving and unsettling and scary in some ways. So if you're having those kind of reactions, that's understandable. Back off, take a breath, relax, connect to your physical body. It's okay. Um, know that that's normal. Um, I see somebody here's asked the question, how do we keep our focus on the good side of life, and why do our brains default to the negative side of life? Yeah, that's a very good question. I'm reminded that meditation in this tradition is not so much about wanting things to be good and not wanting things to be bad. As I articulated earlier, it's really having the skill to open up to and be present to all of our experience and not be caught up in this tug of war, push pull relationship uh, in life. So, um, I think it's just habit. This is the thing. So much of our thinking is conditioned or is habituated. And so it's just a habit that we focus always on the bad side of things. I've heard Minga Rinpoche refer to studies that have been done that said if there's 9 qualities that we have, or 9 qualities that we have, or 10 qualities we have, sorry, 9 of which are good and 1 of which is bad, we will naturally focus on the bad stuff. So, c'est la vie, that's what we do. And it's really just a habit. And one of the best anecdotes for that is to the practice of appreciation. Begin to consciously look for those things that are positive, name them, identify them, celebrate them, and make that your habit in place of looking at the bad side of things. Someone asked, do you think that depression and or trauma can ever go away? I know they can come and go, but do you think they ever leave us? That's a really good question. I have, from my own experience, I have deep conviction that these practices from this tradition can, over time, slowly lead to deep transformation of our relationship to our experience, like trauma and depression. But one of the problems, and I really found this with my own physical trauma in relationship to meditation, it's so easy to get caught up in the expectation that if I just do this meditation right, I will achieve, freedom from suffering. And that in and of itself, this hope, this expectation, is another one of these craving attitudes that I talked about earlier. And that can be just as much a barrier to being with what is and truly open and accepting what is as anything. So I think we have to let go of our expectations around these sorts of things. Someone says, facing the stuff scares me. Yeah, it requires a certain amount of courage to show up and be present for our experience. And that's where the loving kindness practices and compassion practices, particularly for oneself, are really critically important in terms of being able to develop the resilience to standing in the face of difficulty. That's the problem with just awareness, is it'll show you what's there, but it doesn't tell you how to deal with it. It's like, oh my God, you turn the lights on and all you see is a mess. That's not very helpful. So we then need to be able to develop this compassionate, caring, loving heart with the spaciousness to, over time, keep coming back to showing up for standing in the face of our difficulty. And it's something about that perseverance and that compassion and the patience required to do that slowly over time begins to soften the experience or give the possibility for a qualitative change in our relationship to our experience. And it becomes less scary. It becomes less difficult to stand and be with it. Well, hi, David. How can we mitigate fear of falling asleep? I mean, fear is a fascinating thing. I think one of the things that I've learned from my meditation practice is that there is no substitute for awareness, and to watch the mind that gets caught up in these stories and images, see how any challenging experience that comes up, immediately we get triggered and we go down the rabbit hole of the story or the rabbit hole of the images, or the sensations. And there's something about being able to just be there in awareness, Rinpoche talks so much about standing on the bank of the river, not being in the river and swept away by the river. And there's something about awareness and loving kindness that gives us the capacity to create some sort of distance from our experience. And the awareness is so critically important, because with that awareness, then we can see the habits. Every time something comes up and the picture's there, we get caught. Every time we get caught in the story, awareness allows us to see that. And there's something really, really important about that awareness. And in that moment of seeing how the behavior, the pattern, the habit gets us caught every time, at some point when we see it enough, we think, maybe I just don't need to do that anymore. Maybe there's some way in which I could just be with this without it allowing it to trigger, or without the triggering kind of happening in some way. Paul says, yet don't we all expect to get enlightened if we do these practices often enough? Yeah, of course. Why would we not do this if we didn't have faith or confidence in the goal, full awakening? Why would we bother if it wasn't possible? But something, I think the desire for awakening is a wholesome desire, but the grasping and clinging to that, the wanting that, the desperation about that, is as much a barrier to the goal as the practice itself. And so I've really seen this with my meditation of my pain on retreat, or in a daily practice even. As soon as any expectation arises, it's nearly like like being sitting in the front of the roller coaster and you're leaning into it. I feel like sometimes it's like that. I'm just leaning into the experiencing this, and it's really fascinating, and the awareness is really strong, and the inquiry is really strong, but subtly in the back of my mind is this sort of thing. I hope this changes. I hope this goes away. Wouldn't it be great if this could heal this? Et cetera, et cetera. And that's a really insidious, subtle aspect of the mind that we also need to be really, really strongly aware of. Because if we give in to that craving, it's insidious. It's also delusional from my experience. This whole, there's some way in which the idealism, the spiritual idealism, is as equally delusional as anything in our practice, in my mind. Spiritual idealism, yes. Or I coined a phrase once, Mara. And for those of you who don't know who Mara is the maker of the afflictive emotions. Mara loves to masquerade as spiritual idealism. So that might be quotable. Isn't the desire more about having wisdom? Yes, there's also the interesting thing from the Buddhist, from the Abhidhamma, the Buddhist psychology perspective, what is known as Abhidhamma. Desire is ethically neutral. And what I mean by that is that desire in itself is not bad. It's all about the motivation and the object of desire. And so desiring awakening, desiring for freedom from suffering, desiring to be happy, desire for peace, desire for all beings to be safe and happy and well. These are wholesome desires. These are good, positive qualities of the mind that lead to favorable outcomes. But desiring, when the desire is fueled by greed and avarice and lust, then it will not lead to favorable outcomes. And so it's not the desire that's the problem, it's the motivation and the object of desire that is the distinguishing. Yeah. The book should recommend someone in the beginner to meditation to practice Buddhism. One of my favorite books is Mingyur Rinpoche's Joy of Living. Oh, it's gone from the shelf. Somebody's got it somewhere. And then Rinpoche's second book, The Joyful Wisdom. The Joy of Living is really great for beginners. Joy of Living. Just because, it was the first book Rinpoche wrote back in 2007. It was published. It became a bestseller. But it's like his story, his narration is like he's in your head, telling you about your own heart and mind, revealing to you how your own heart and mind operates. And it is so relatable. And he makes fun. He makes fun of the way we create our suffering, and he makes it so simple how the meditation works. So The Joy of Living, I would thoroughly recommend for anybody who's a beginner. We also on our Tergar or learning.tergar.org, there is a currently you have to create a profile to access it, but there's currently an introduction to meditation that is a 4-video series by Mingyur Rinpoche. It's a little bit old, and we're currently revamping it with new material, which I understand will very shortly be available. We're very close. It's in the final stages. And it will also be, you'll be able to access it by the Tergar app on your smartphone. There's an app for that. And the Tergar app, which can keep track of your practice. And shortly, if you have that profile, you'll be able to access a free introductory to meditation class there, which is really great. And so learning.tergar.org. There's a huge amount of resources on our website if you're interested. Sometimes looking deeply at these difficult emotions makes my depression worse. Yes, that's why I said it's not the panacea. And in actual fact, awareness can re-traumatize a lot of our, if we have trauma in our experience. So developing the knowledge, the understanding of when to apply, when to back off is really, really important. And so if you feel like your meditation is making things worse, take a break. There's so many other things, because depression is such a constellation of so many things. There are so many other things that you can do, physical health, activity, see a therapist. But as I said, this is not my area of expertise, but I want to be clear that meditation may not be the answer for you at this time. It may work at other times. And I invite you to develop the capacity to discern when it's working, when it's not working, and try different techniques. So we are very close to the top of the hour, which I think means we've gone a little bit over time. But much appreciation for joining me here this evening. I am very, very grateful for your participation. And I'm also really happy that Tergar, with our resources, we've been able to provide all of this material online. We'll go through the end of this month, and then I think we're going to slow it down a little bit. Won't be so much through June. And then we're planning to offer retreats online in July and August. So there'll be lots more information coming out about that in the next few weeks. So thank you all very much. Wherever you are, whatever's going on, may you be well and happy, stay safe, and hope to see you again soon. Thanks for joining me. Take care.